Aloha, everybody. Welcome to our live today on how to release perfectionism and your need to feel in control. This is definitely a topic that I love sharing about because it's something that I see a lot of women struggle with, something that I myself have struggled with. Hi, Jen. Glad you're here. And so this really today's training is for you if you struggle with perfectionism, with all or nothing thinking, which I'm going to talk about, with letting go of control. So the three things I'm going to be teaching you basically are how perfectionism and all or nothing thinking and people pleasing all go hand in hand because they are a trauma response. And we can heal that trauma response by learning how to surrender, by leaning into imperfection, by trusting that we're safe. And that's a huge one, is that if we don't feel safe in our body, it's hard to trust that we are being taken care of. It's hard to trust and let go of that control. And so what we need is really to learn how to create our own personal paradise, our own inner sanctuary within our body so that we feel safe, so that we can shift out of that survival mode into our safe, soothing mode. So that's sort of the first piece. The second piece is we have to learn how to shed those kind of unhealthy or old patterns of perfectionism, right? Those parts of us that live in that polarized thinking, that place of all or nothing. Either we are doing it perfectly or we're a failure, right? It's like sometimes one or the other in our mind, even though we know that is an irrational thought. We have to learn how to reframe that and essentially embrace more of the uncertainty that comes from living in like the gray area of life, which is actually where life happens, right? So we have to learn how to sort of step out of our comfort zone, how to take greater risks as a parent, as a professional, and as a partner. And the last piece is really learning how to fiercely and radically love yourself so that you can really connect to your highest and wisest self through elite embodiment practices that will elevate you, elevate your curiosity, your courage, your confidence to really uplevel your life and your business and your relationships. So I want to talk first about perfectionism as a trauma response. And also, I forgot to introduce myself. So for those who don't know me, my name is Sarah Slater Snyder. I am a licensed clinical social worker in private practice as a licensed therapist, and I'm also a registered yoga teacher and an elite embodiment coach. And I really started my coaching practice because I found that so many women were really struggling and having difficulty accessing mental health and just wellness support during the pandemic because therapists are in such high demand. And that's why I created the Women's Wellness Circle, was to have that safe space for women to come together and connect and support one another in our wellness. So I want to start by just asking you, on a scale of 1 to 10 of perfectionism, I asked this within the Women's Wellness Circle, but I want you to reflect on this again. On the scale of 1 to 10 of perfectionism, if 10 is like obsessing over every detail and 1 is like letting shit go, where are you, right? Like if you're able to sort of let it go and not obsess over it and not worry about it, then you're going to be lower on that scale, right? Think about that for a moment. Where are you on that 1 to 10 scale? Right. I know for me personally, and go ahead and drop that in the comments. Jen, I'd love to hear from you as well, since you're here with me. For me personally, I definitely used to be at a 10 for many years. And then I was able, through a lot of inner work on myself, I was able to get to a point where now I'm at like a 2, maybe a 3. I have days, don't get me wrong, where I'm like right back up to a 7 or an 8, but most days I'm like a 2 or a 3. Some days even a 1, right? Which is like the most liberating experience. Jen, you said you're a 5, below a 5, right on, depending on the situation. Yeah, and you weren't that years ago. Exactly. And I'd love to know what has helped you, right? What has helped you to shift out of that perfectionism? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And also, based on where you are on that scale, where do you want to be, right? So if you're like a 5 or above, where do you want to be on that scale, my guess is generally most of us want to be below a 5, right? So there's something though that I want to explain, and this is just a simple hand model of the brain, just because I'm going to talk about sort of how the brain and the body are connected in this way. So if you take your hand, you make a fist, right? This comes from Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. Basically, the idea is that we've got the downstairs part of the brain, so like where our wrist and our hand meet, that's our brainstem, and it's responsible for all of our like automatic survival functions, heart rate, breathing, digestion, the things we don't have to think about, right? That's all downstairs brain. As well as where we tuck our thumb in here, right? That is our limbic system. The limbic system is our emotional brain. That's the part of us that processes emotion, that sometimes gets reactive and is irrational, right? That's where fear and anger and aggression are processed, is that limbic system. And the upstairs brain, which sits behind the forehead, is where our knuckles are. Again, if this is like the, if our hand is representing the brain, the upstairs brain is right where the knuckles are. And that is your prefrontal cortex. That's responsible for judgment, planning, decision-making, long-term thinking, impulse control, empathy, like emotional regulation. And what happens, according to Dan Siegel, is that the amygdala, which is part of our limbic system, hijacks the rest of the brain. When we are in a fight or flight state, when we are in a stress response, essentially, right, our nervous system immediately goes into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment. But the idea with all of those different stress responses, and actually stress and trauma, they're not one and the same, but often, especially if we've had the experience of trauma, we are perceiving a stressor as threatening, even if it's not actually threatening. Our body is feeling unsafe, or our mind is feeling unsafe, and so we go into that stress or trauma response. So what's happening is literally what he calls amygdala hijack. It's like the upstairs brain is no longer talking to the downstairs brain. It's like disconnected from each other, so to speak. And we have to practice and work on getting that upstairs brain to sort of hug the downstairs brain and start the communication there again, which is why we have to create safety in the body first, right? And so I'm going to talk about how we do that. So another important model to understand is something called our 3 systems of emotional regulation, which is really important, because this is a psychology model that basically talks about how many of us operate and spend our time in what's called drive mode, or the drive system. The drive system is like the go, 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 task oriented, kind of getting shit done part of ourselves, right? And many of us spend a lot of time there, especially if we are, you know, busy, professional, ambitious women, which all of you are, right? We often are in that drive system quite a bit. The problem though is that we also then have our threat system. The threat system is like survival mode. It's the part of us that is that lower downstairs brain that gets into that survival mode, where we're operating from a place of like constant anxiety and overwhelm, and really like fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn. And so what's happening is that when we're in that state essentially of survival mode, of threat mode, we are not we can't access, remember that model of the brain, we can't access the upstairs brain. So we're not thinking logically or rationally, or we're not able to even stop ourselves or pause really to before responding, which is why we sometimes get very reactive, right? And so what happens is that we aren't taking time to be in that 3rd system, which is our soothing system. And so the way that our nervous system works is we have that fight or flight, that sympathetic part of the nervous system, where again, that's part of the stress response. The body releases all these stress hormones that elevates our heart rate, our breathing. It shifts everything. All the automatic functions. Digestion actually starts to slow down, because we don't really need to digest if we're in an emergency situation, right? So we're in that sympathetic fight or flight state. What happens though, and what we can learn how to do, and where so many people miss this and they don't know that you have the control to actually access the counter part of our nervous system. You have the ability to counteract stress, to counteract the trauma response. And it's actually through that. So activating a different part of the nervous system is what's called our parasympathetic nervous system. It's the rest and digest relaxation response, which you can access through your breath. I have a bunch of different neuro hacks and different strategies to allow you to actually access different parts of that parasympathetic response. And when we do that, that is what actually calms down that fight or flight. That's what starts to get the upstairs brain back online. That's what allows us to sort of counteract that perfectionism, that because literally perfectionism is a trauma response. So let me talk about that for a moment. So the idea of, again, thinking about that when we are in that threat mode, that sort of like go 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 to survive mode, right? We are often sort of okay, so two parts. One, when we're in the fight part of our stress response system, we are getting like angry, explosive. Sometimes we're controlling. We're sometimes a little bit in self-preservation mode, literally. Versus when we're in like the flight part of that trauma response, or the stress response, sympathetic nervous system arousal, we're more in like doer mode. Flight mode is perfectionism, is the part of you that's overworking, overachieving. That's like the workaholic part of us. That's the part of us that gets stuck in these like anxious, overthinking cycles. And that's where so many people get stuck, because often what tends to happen from that is then we go into freeze mode where we are avoiding, escaping. We are procrastinating. That's a huge one. We kind of get stuck. We have difficulty making decisions when we're in that freeze mode. It's almost like we're immobilized, literally. We are kind of isolating, we're numb, we're feeling stuck, right? That is that freeze response, where we're just not able to take action. The last piece of it is what's called the fawn response. The fawn response is literally like, almost from an evolutionary perspective, it's like playing dead, but from sort of more like a tangible everyday perspective, it looks like people pleasing, not having boundaries, saying yes to everything, being highly codependent, conflict avoidant, being overwhelmed, kind of losing our identity, right? All of these, again, are just different elements of this trauma response. And perfectionism looks different depending on which response you're in. But what I want you just to know is that you can heal this. Like, you actually have the capacity to heal this part of you. And so lots of ways to do this in terms of healing that trauma response, right? So we can obviously connect with trained professionals. We can work with a trauma therapist. We can work with trauma-informed practitioners, whether that's a coach or someone else. But really what we need to do is learn how to tap into our body's nervous system, which is so brilliantly built that we have the capacity to counteract that fight or flight response, right? And or freeze or fawn. We actually have the ability, using our breath, tapping into what's called our vagus nerve, which is a nerve that runs through the diaphragm, that literally when we take deep exhale breaths, that vagus nerve gets stimulated, sends a message to the brain to slow the fight or flight response and activate the parasympathetic rest and digest response. And so many people miss this. And this is why when people tell you, just do deep breathing, that's why it works. And deep breathing isn't the only way to activate the parasympathetic response, but it's one really effective way. There are lots of other ways. You can take contrast showers, 3 minutes hot to 1 minute cold. Think about what happens when you get in a cold shower. Immediately, like, your whole body lets out a deep sigh from that cold water. There's many different ways to access that. And that's what I teach, literally, are these neuro hacks to tap into that parasympathetic response. Restorative yoga, yoga nidra, there's so many different ways to do it. But we have to learn how to literally calm the body. And then we can learn how to build awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors and our responses. And as part of that, right, we are building literally safety and connection. Connection to ourselves, but also connection to other people. So I want to talk a little bit about, okay, what do we do now that we've got a sense of like, what is this whole perfectionism thing? It's important to realize, like, often we lean into, or we resort to perfectionistic kinds of tendencies. Thank you, Jen. We resort to these, like, tendencies where we are feeling like we have to have control over everything. And that generally results when we, as a child growing up, we are lacking control. We feel a loss of control, whether that's within our home environment, maybe it's within our school environment, whatever it is, we're feeling like we just don't have control. And as a result, we go to the opposite of that. We sort of go into hyper control. And that is really what perfectionism is this need to be in control. And so there's nothing wrong with you, but there is something in you that needs to be healed, right? And I want to talk about this really helpful model. So all of that is sort of part of like the first step of my embodied paradise method is learning how to actually calm the body, and the really helping you to tap into that parasympathetic part of your nervous system so that you can experience this sort of expansive regulation, nervous system regulation, which is the key to mental health, which is the key to letting go of perfectionism. The second piece, though, is actually learning how to reframe our thoughts. So, if you think about our mind, right, we've got these three components of our mind. We've got the emotional mind, the irrational mind, which is that downstairs brain, it's that limbic system, it's that literally the emotional part of ourselves that gets pretty irrational. That's the part of us that uses all or nothing thinking, this very polarized way of seeing the world. And what we have to learn how to do is tap into the upstairs brain, tap into what we call more of our like reasonable mind or our rational mind, where we can counter that irrational part of ourselves. And where the two overlap is what we call the wise mind, right? And this is a dialectical behavioral therapy technique of learning how to access your wise mind. And we do this through some of the techniques that I teach, but also once we feel safe, we feel calm in the body, then we can actually use more of like a cognitive behavioral kind of approach to understanding how our thoughts connect to our feelings, which then affect and connect to our behaviors, right? And so what we're learning how to do is essentially, one, we have to acknowledge and recognize where our cognitive distortions are, where our thought errors are, right? So if we tend to believe in this all or nothing thinking, the belief that it has to be perfect or else I'm a failure, right? And so many of us see what we're doing in that way, which is why so many of us get stuck, right? We have trouble moving forward because we feel like it has to be perfect. And I can't tell you how many people I work with within my therapy practice, as well as my wellness practice, my coaching business, where essentially it's like people, these women and girls feel like we have to be operating at like 98, 99% all the time, even 100% all the time. And so the work that I do is really helping them to say, you know what, is it realistic that I can give like 100% of myself all the time? No, we're going to burn out. What we can do, however, is maybe give ourselves some room to live in the gray area. Instead of being so black and white, all or nothing, maybe I can accept being in more of like 90%, giving 90% effort, 93% effort, right? Even that is healthier than the 99% or the 100%. So some of this is giving yourself permission to kind of approach things a little bit differently. And some of this is almost like redefining success, right? So learning how we're literally looking at and defining success. So for example, we need to learn how to reframe success by shifting from what's called like a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, right? When we lean into a growth mindset, that is more like we have the ability to lean into uncertainty, to step out of our comfort zone, to take greater risks as like a parent and a partner and a professional, and this is a big piece. So I'm going to give you some simple things that you can do to help you reframe, right? So rather than evaluating your behavior or the things that you're doing as if sort of your fault as like a person, you're blaming almost like your character, your disposition, who you are, right? So for example, maybe it's like you forgot to call your friend on their birthday and you think to yourself, I'm a bad friend. Well, no, it's not so much that you're a bad friend, but more just the behavior, like you forgot to call your friend, right? And so when we lean into that, we can say, well, that behavior wasn't very thoughtful of me, but I know I'm a good friend, and so I'm going to reach out to that friend. And so part of this is also learning how to like let go of guilt and shame, right? Brene Brown makes a really great distinction that guilt is seeing our behavior as I did something bad, whereas shame is I am bad. Seeing that like, so it's again, it's sort of like this is a huge one for a lot of the like younger teens that I work with, is seeing, let's say they fail a test and they see, like basically the guilt would be feeling guilty and badly that I failed that at that test, versus the shame is I am a failure, right? And that's such an important distinction, totally. And a subtle part of that shift, right? So the fixed mindset is basically this belief that like you're seeing your failures as like the limitations of your abilities. So it's almost like if you fail at something, you just basically, that's it. You feel like I'm either good at it or I'm not. My abilities are unchanging and I'm going to give up because I failed and I'm going to be a failure at everything, right? So it's sort of this like giving up when you're frustrated, not being persistent, not really having grit, sticking to what you know, not taking risks, versus the growth mindset of seeing failure as just an opportunity to grow, right? Like seeing a mistake as just, this is part of learning. So challenges are just a way to learn. It's a way to help me grow, which in that case, we're receptive to feedback. We're more willing to take risks, more willing to try new things, right? So important to be able to reframe it that way. The fixed mindset is sort of this like, I suck, I'm not good at this, I'm a failure. Growth mindset is I'm learning. Mistakes are just an opportunity to learn. That's it, right? And so I'll give you just a really subtle reframe, but it like is so powerful, is when you are able to take one of your like criticisms, one of the self-criticisms that you tend to experience. So I'm not good at this. I don't understand this. I'm not in the career I love. I'm not my best self. Whatever it is, I'm not a good partner. Just add on the word yet. I'm not there yet, right? I'm not good at this yet. I don't understand this yet. I'm not the partner I want to be yet. I'm not in a career I love yet, right? Because what that says, that reframe, is taking it from this polarizing place of I'll never be these things to I'm a work in progress, right? Like I'm learning how to step into who I am and lean into failure, lean into risk taking, right? Lean into making mistakes. And I got to tell you, like the most successful people are those people who see failure as a way to actually catapult themselves forward, as a way to grow, right? It's sort of this idea of like seeing our ability as static, which is the fixed mindset, versus our ability is sort of developing. That's the growth mindset, right? It's so different and really game changing. And so part of what I teach in terms of like the second pillar of my embodied paradise method is learning how to essentially catch your irrational thinking, your distorted thoughts, and identifying it, naming it, like, oh, I'm in all or nothing thinking again. I even have my clients like name that part of themselves, right? Like, so again, that irrational part of the mind is the amygdala. So like we call it angry Amy, judgy Judy, whatever it is. Like you make up a silly name and you attach a funny adjective to it, and there's a self-distancing that happens when we do that, right? Because we're not criticizing ourselves, we're criticizing that irrational part of ourselves. So that's a piece of it, is catching it and identifying it. And then the other piece is not judging it. That's huge. The non-judgment is where a lot of people get stuck, right? Because we have to learn how to be patient, how to be loving, how to be kind and compassionate with ourselves before we are going to be able to really embrace failure, to be able to embrace and release perfectionism. And so as we do that, then we can start challenging our cognitive distortions. And so part of like releasing that need to feel in control is learning how to tolerate what it feels like when we're not in control. And in psychology, we call this distress tolerance, literally learning how to tolerate distress. So many of my clients, especially my highly anxious clients, believe that they can't handle it. They can't tolerate the anxiety that comes with whatever it may be. The thing is that that's their challenge, right? And so much of what we're doing is teaching them, let's try it. Let's try it at a level that you're comfortable with, right? Maybe we're not going to go, do like 100% of that thing that you're uncomfortable with that's sparking anxiety, but maybe we can start with like 10%. Like, what is one small way that we can show ourselves, oh, wow, I actually have tools that I can use to calm my anxiety, right? I can ground into my body. I can tap into and self-soothe through my five senses, and I can come into the present moment, right? And so rather than essentially like resisting reality, we learn the practice of radical acceptance. We learn how to accept what's not in our control. And in doing that, there's so much freedom that comes. There's so much just like liberation that comes, and there's like this deep exhale, which adds to the safety that we're creating in our body and our mind, right? So when we shift the focus from what's out of our control to what's in our control, that is a huge piece of releasing perfectionism, right? And then the other piece, and this is also very subtle, but I teach my therapy clients and my wellness clients how to understand and really heal and care for what we call their adaptive child, right? The adaptive child is the part of you that maybe experienced trauma, that felt like things were out of control growing up, and that's the part of you that's clinging to control now, right? Versus that's the adaptive child self versus the functional adult self, which is the part of you that is more in your upstairs brain. That's the part of you that knows, that's able to be rational, that knows that you are actually safe, that knows that can recognize when you're in that all or nothing thinking. That's the part of you that can actually challenge that all or nothing thinking, right? And so when we learn how to, one, acknowledge that that adaptive child exists within ourselves, and we learn how to like feel our way through that, lean into that a little bit, we can actually catch it, and we can somewhat stop the experience of being in that place of essentially like overreacting, overgiving, overworking, like all of those trauma responses. We learn that we don't have to work for love. We don't have to earn love. We don't, I mean, we look at sort of, we break down what are some of the core beliefs that you're struggling with, right? And then from that place, we can then say, look, when you are in your functional adult self, you are not needing any of those things. We don't need, from a place of like our adult self, we are not needing to necessarily be in control. It's when we're in that adaptive child place that we're like clinging to control, right? So that's a big one. So letting go, learning that you're safe, leaning into imperfection, allowing yourself to be perfectly imperfect, allowing yourself to trust that you are safe even when things feel unknown, or you feel like things are unpredictable or out of your control. If you can learn how to create safety in those situations, man, you are going to be so much better off. You are absolutely going to be celebrating bravery over perfection, right? That's a big shift, is like learning how to, rather than focus so much on getting it perfect, can I be brave? Can I celebrate that I'm being brave? Like, I have to tell you guys, so much of this coaching wellness business for me is just trying new things. Like, I'm constantly, it's like trial and error. Like, I don't know what's going to work. I don't know what's going to get responses, what's not. But it's a lot of leaning into failure. It's a lot of just celebrating myself for being brave and for trying new things over being perfect, right? And I'll just tell you, Jen, thank you. She said, ooh, bravery over perfection. Exactly. And I'll just tell you that that's exactly why I created these cards, right? My radical self-love affirmation cards came because I was seeing so many women that were struggling with these issues, right? And I really wanted to be able to have a way for women to have these reminders that, you know, we don't have to get it perfect all the time. That here, I just pulled one. I am wise beyond my years. Yes, you are, right? That I'm able to trust that everything happens for a reason. Sometimes this is a really hard one, especially if we have a history of trauma, right? Because we don't feel safe. And so we have to really learn how to be in our own nervous system and our own body in a way that we feel safe, right? So I'll give you one more. Hang on. Let me find one that really resonates. Here's a good one. I'm able to catch and reframe my negative self-talk into healthy, positive, and loving affirmations, right? So I have a whole bunch of these. I mean, there's tons of these within this. I do sell these radical self-love affirmation cards. If you work with me privately or join my Abounding Woman program, you'll get a copy of these cards. They also make fabulous stocking stuffers. I will just tell you, they're on sale, or they will be on sale around Black Friday. But I sell them for $33 on my website, aboundingcircles.com. And so I just wanted to share, before we kind of move into the last segment here, the last piece of this, like, there's so many benefits to learning how to reduce your cognitive distortions, right? So like learning how to get out of your mind, out of that mental overthinking, and really connect and ground into your own experience and your own awarenesses. There's just so many benefits, right? So one, we're building awareness of those thought errors. Two, we are changing those thought errors. We're learning how to reframe it. And actually, once we identify it, then we're learning how to change and shift into those healthier thought distortions, or those, more sort of radical self-love affirmations. And when we separate ourselves from the thoughts in these ways, we're practicing what's called metacognition. And we are really, like, much more so getting into that prefrontal cortex. We're engaging that higher level thinking. And so the last piece of this puzzle, right, is really the third pillar of my embodied paradise method, which is releasing perfectionism through radical self-love, through connecting to your highest and wisest self, right? Through this process of seeing our best self. That is metacognition. When we stop and we pause and we breathe and we reflect on, like, how would my best self respond in this situation, right? How would my highest self, my wisest self, what would my best self do differently in this situation? That is a game changer. That's literally, you're engaging your prefrontal cortex. You're out of survival mode. You're now in the upstairs brain, and you're able to actually, like, connect to your highest self, right? That is part of these elite embodiment practices, which incorporate meditation, which incorporate mindfulness, breathing, metacognition, right? That allows us to essentially accept and, like, fiercely love ourselves, right? As we are. And how powerful is that? We don't have to change a single thing. We can embrace our perfectly imperfect selves, right? And so as we create time and space to come home to our highest self through these elite embodiment practices, that's what elevates our curiosity and our courage and our confidence, so that we can up level our life and our business and our relationships, right? And what I find is that my clients who actually start pouring back into themselves through these radical self-love practices, through these elite embodiment practices, they feel happier, they feel more motivated, they're less anxious, more connected to themselves, more present with their loved ones. They have so much more clarity. They're no longer stuck and immobilized. They can take decisive, bold, steps and action. And they're no longer maybe procrastinating, and they're making decisions that feel good for themselves, right? Like, they're letting go of things in their life, whether that's substances or relationships that are toxic, and they're stepping into a higher version, an elevated elite version of themselves. And that's really what I teach. And so if this speaks to you, I mean, if you are interested in diving deeper into this to learn a little bit more about your adaptive child, to learn a little bit more about these elite embodiment practices, how to create safety in the body, how to reframe some of these distorted thinking, and really how to radically practice self-love, please reach out to me. All you need to do is drop release in the comments, and I will reach out privately, and I'd love to connect with you. We can set up a free 20-minute pathway call just to see, like, what's working for you within your current, life, business experience, and we'll identify where there may be some gaps, and how my embodied paradise method can actually help you to fill those gaps and to step into that higher level, elite version of yourself. And this is what I love more than anything, you guys. So I really appreciate Jen, you just sharing. Earlier, she was commenting and just said, what did you say? You said, I highly recommend Sarah, whether one-on-one or group. Yeah, Jen did my Abounding Woman program, and we just had the most fun and such an incredible experience. And I just love to share more about what it is that I do and how I can support you. So whether you're watching this live or you're catching the replay, again, if you are just wanting to learn how to kind of take some of these things that I've taught you today and really implement them into your life in a little bit of a deeper way, just drop the word release, and I'll teach you how to let some shit go, so that you don't have to obsess over every detail, and you don't have to be in that anxious overthinking survival mode anymore, right? We can really let go of that perfectionism and that need to feel in control, and start to embrace sort of our highest and wisest self. And I would love that. Yeah. So if that interests you, if you want to learn how to embody that elite potential as the calm, conscious, and confident CEO of your life and your business, drop release, and I will reach out to you privately. Thank you guys so much. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. You can connect to me within the DMs. You can email me, sarah@aboundingcircles.com. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking this time. All right. Aloha, everybody.